A marriage that looks solid from the outside begins to collapse when a husband notices his wife building a second life behind careful smiles. As children, friends, and reputation are pulled into the conflict, every choice becomes louder than words, and silence starts doing more damage than arguments ever could. Andrew Miller never thought of himself as naive, but he did believe that long-term consistency counted for something. He built his life around routines that made space for everyone else. Early mornings getting the kids ready for school, late evenings finishing work so weekends stayed free. The kind of schedule that didn't look impressive but held a family together. His wife, Vanessa, had once appreciated that. She used to say it was comforting to know exactly where he would be at any given hour. They had 2 children, 10-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jacob, and most days revolved around drop-offs, packed lunches, forgotten homework, and the quiet relief of bedtime when the house finally slowed down. From the outside, their life looked stable in a way that invited comments from friends about how lucky they were. Andrew accepted those comments without much thought, assuming stability was something you maintained, not something you questioned. The changes began small enough to dismiss. Vanessa started going out more often in the evenings, always with reasonable explanations that sounded responsible when said quickly, helping a friend through a divorce, networking for future opportunities, attending events she insisted were important for their social standing. She talked more about appearances, about how people saw them as a couple, about how fragile reputations could be if neglected. Andrew didn't argue. He adjusted. He stayed home with the kids, helped Emma practice spelling words at the kitchen table while Jacob colored quietly nearby, telling himself that marriages evolved and this was just another phase. The first moment that stayed with him happened on a Sunday afternoon when Vanessa came home late, smiling in a way that didn't quite match the exhaustion she claimed to feel. Emma asked if Mom would read with her before bed like she used to, and Vanessa hesitated just long enough for Andrew to notice before promising to do it tomorrow. Tomorrow became a word Andrew started hearing more often. A week later, Jacob asked why Mom always took her phone into the bathroom now, whispering it like a secret he wasn't sure he should be sharing. Andrew laughed it off for his sake, but that night he noticed Vanessa turning her screen down whenever he walked into the room, replying to messages with her body angled away from him, as if proximity itself had become something to manage. When Andrew tried to talk about it, not accusing but curious, Vanessa reacted with irritation instead of reassurance, reminding him of everything she carried on her shoulders, asking if he really wanted to add suspicion to the list. She mentioned what her parents would think if they heard him questioning her loyalty, how people loved to gossip, how dangerous it was to give others the wrong impression. The conversation ended with Andrew apologizing for upsetting her, even though he couldn't quite explain why his concern had turned into something that felt like wrongdoing. The real shift came the night Andrew returned home earlier than expected after a meeting was canceled. The house was quiet except for Emma's television playing in the background. She sat curled up on the couch, her backpack still on the floor beside her. When Andrew asked where her mother was, Emma shrugged and said she left after dinner, telling them she would be back soon and not to wait up. Jacob appeared from the hallway, asking if Dad could help him with his pajamas because Mom forgot again. Andrew tucked his son into bed, listening to the normal sounds of the house while something unfamiliar pressed against his chest. Vanessa came home close to midnight, moving carefully through the door as if hoping not to be noticed. She kissed the kids quickly, avoiding questions, and went straight to the shower. Andrew stood in the hallway long enough to hear her phone vibrate repeatedly on the counter, messages piling up without being checked. When she came out, wrapped in a towel, he asked where she had been. She answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, giving a story that made sense on the surface but skipped details Andrew would have recognized before. When he didn't respond right away, she filled the silence by talking about how stressful things had been, how much pressure she felt to keep everything together, how she couldn't afford mistakes with so many people watching. Andrew nodded, not because he agreed, but because something inside him had started paying attention. That night, lying awake beside her. He realized that whatever Vanessa was building outside their marriage required careful timing, controlled conversations, and a version of him who didn't ask questions. By morning, he still didn't know the truth, but he knew he had stopped being part of the life she was actively managing, and that realization changed the way he watched everything that followed. Andrew didn't confront Vanessa the next morning, not because he believed her story, but because he wanted to see what she did when she thought the moment had passed. He took the kids to school as usual, listening to Emma talk about a group project while Jacob complained about the laces on his shoes. And it struck him how carefully he had been arranging his life around Vanessa's absences without ever calling them that. After drop-off, instead of going straight to work, he returned home and sat at the kitchen table where unfinished homework still lay, staring at the place where Vanessa's phone usually rested. It wasn't there. She had taken it with her into the shower again, something she had never done before. When she finally came downstairs dressed and hurried, she kissed him on the cheek, mentioned a lunch meeting, and left without asking about the kids' morning, as if those details no longer belonged to her. Andrew waited 10 minutes, then followed her, keeping a distance that felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. He watched her park 2 blocks away from a cafe she claimed she hated, then sit in her car longer than anyone waiting for a meeting would. A man arrived shortly after, someone Andrew recognized immediately, not from friendship, but from proximity. A father from their kid's school who had once joked with Vanessa during pickup while Andrew stood a few steps away. They didn't touch, not at first. They talked, leaning toward each other, laughing in a way that didn't exist at home anymore. When they finally walked inside together, Andrew didn't follow. He sat in his car, knowing that seeing more wouldn't give him clarity, only confirmation he wasn't ready to manage yet. That evening, Emma asked if Mom would come to her school play rehearsal tomorrow, and Andrew said he would check, then found himself sending a message he never thought he would send, asking Vanessa to be home early because the kids needed her. The reply came quickly, apologetic but vague, promising to try, followed by a reminder about how unpredictable her schedule had become. Later that night, Andrew went to put Jacob to bed and found him holding a crumpled drawing of their family, all 4 of them drawn together, except Mom was standing slightly apart, her hand not touching anyone. When Andrew asked about it, Jacob shrugged and said Mom was always busy now, so he didn't know where to put her. Andrew didn't correct him. He tucked the drawing into his pocket instead. The next day, Andrew asked a friend from work to cover a meeting and went back to the school early, arriving just in time to see Vanessa standing near the gate with the same man from the cafe. Their heads close enough that conversation looked unnecessary. When Emma ran toward them, Vanessa stepped back quickly, smoothing her expression, introducing the man casually as someone helping with a community project. And Andrew noticed how naturally the lie slid into place. That night, after the kids were asleep, Andrew finally asked Vanessa to sit down with him, not raising his voice, not accusing, just asking who the man was and why she kept seeing him. Vanessa didn't deny knowing him, but she laughed it off, calling Andrew paranoid, saying parents talked all the time, that he was embarrassing her by jumping to conclusions, that if he kept this up people would start to notice and talk. She mentioned how her mother would react if she heard Andrew was making accusations, how damaging it could be for their image, how unfair it was to put the children at risk of gossip. Andrew listened, noticed how quickly the conversation turned away from his question and toward his behavior, and when he didn't respond the way she expected, Vanessa's tone shifted. She warned him not to make scenes, not to dig where there was nothing to find, reminding him that stability mattered more than suspicion. Later that night, Andrew checked the family tablet Emma used for homework and found it still synced to Vanessa's email. He didn't search long. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. Plans, excuses, shared jokes about timing, complaints about how careful they had to be, all stacked together into something that left no room for misunderstanding. Andrew closed the tablet and sat there until the screen went dark. Knowing the story he had been watching from a distance was now pulling him in whether he wanted it to or not, and that Whatever he chose to do next would change not just his marriage, but the way his children understood the adults they trusted most. Andrew didn't sleep that night, not because his mind was racing, but because it kept circling the same practical questions he had avoided for too long. He woke before dawn, packed lunches, signed school papers, and moved through the morning on instinct while Vanessa slept, her phone face down on the knitstand, silent for the first time in days. At drop-off, Emma asked if everything was okay because Mom forgot to hug her again, and Andrew said she was just tired, then sat in the car afterward longer than necessary, realizing how often he had been translating Vanessa's absence into harmless explanations for the kids. Instead of going to work, he drove to a lawyer's office recommended by a colleague who didn't ask questions but gave him a number with a quiet seriousness Andrew couldn't ignore. The consultation was brief and uncomfortable, filled with terms Andrew never imagined applying to his own life: custody schedules, financial disclosures, documentation. He didn't commit to anything, but he left with a list of things to pay attention to, behaviors that mattered, patterns that could no longer be dismissed. That afternoon, Vanessa called him unusually early, asking where he was and why he hadn't answered her messages. Andrew said he was busy and would be home on time. Nothing more. The lack of reassurance unsettled her, and when she arrived that evening, she moved through the house restlessly, asking the kids too many questions, checking Andrew's mood instead of theirs. During dinner, Jacob knocked over his cup, and Vanessa snapped at him sharply, then immediately softened when she noticed Andrew watching, apologizing in a way that felt rehearsed. Later, while Emma practiced her lines for the school play, Andrew sat nearby and realized Vanessa hadn't asked once about rehearsal or shown interest in attending anymore. That night, Andrew told Vanessa he had a work event the following evening and would be late. She nodded too quickly, already distracted, and Andrew saw an opportunity form without planning it. The next evening, instead of going to work, he picked up the kids early and dropped them at his sister's house, saying they would have a sleepover. He then returned home and waited. Vanessa arrived later than usual, surprised to find the house empty and Andrew sitting in the living room. She asked where the kids were, irritation flashing before concern, and Andrew told her calmly they were safe. He didn't raise his voice or accuse her. He simply asked if she planned to see the man from the cafe again that night. Vanessa froze, then laughed, calling him dramatic, asking if he had followed her. Andrew said he hadn't needed to, that the messages had explained enough. Her expression changed then, not into guilt, but into calculation. She accused him of invading her privacy, of setting a terrible example for the children, of turning a difficult period into something ugly. When Andrew didn't argue back, she shifted tactics, telling him he was overreacting, that nothing physical had happened, that he was risking everything over harmless conversations. Andrew asked her to stop and tell him the truth, not a version shaped for comfort or reputation. Vanessa hesitated, then admitted she had feelings, that she felt alive talking to someone who saw her differently, that she didn't intend for it to go as far as it had. Andrew pointed out that feelings didn't require secret meetings or careful lies, and that the planning itself was a choice. Vanessa's tone hardened. She warned him not to make this public, not to involve lawyers, not to drag the kids through something that would damage them, reminding him of how quickly stories spread and how people always blamed the mother more harshly. Andrew listened, noticed how the threat wasn't about losing him, but about losing control of how she would be seen. When he said he needed time to think and would be staying elsewhere for a few days, Vanessa accused him of abandoning the family, of choosing pride over stability, of hurting the kids to prove a point. Andrew didn't respond right away. He went to the hallway, picked up Emma's backpack from the floor, and realized how often Vanessa talked about protecting the children while rarely adjusting her behavior for them. As he packed a small bag, Vanessa followed him from room to room, alternating between anger and pleading, reminding him of their history, their shared friends, the embarrassment this would cause if anyone found out. Andrew left without responding to any of it, understanding for the first time that silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was the only way to stop being pulled back into a story he hadn't chosen, but was now responsible for finishing. Andrew stayed with his sister longer than he planned. Not because he was hiding, but because every day away from the house stripped another layer of illusion from the situation. His sister didn't interrogate him, didn't push opinions. She simply watched how carefully he explained things to the kids during video calls, how he avoided promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Emma asked when everyone would be back together again, and Andrew answered honestly without drama, saying things were complicated right now, and that none of it was because of her or Jacob. That night, Vanessa began calling repeatedly, her messages shifting tone with each attempt, starting with irritation, moving into concern, and finally settling into something sharper when Andrew didn't respond. She accused him of making her look unstable, of letting people fill in gaps with rumors, of putting her in an impossible position with her parents and friends who had already begun asking why she was suddenly alone at school events. The next day, Andrew received a message from Vanessa's mother, carefully worded but heavy with implication, asking if everything was all right and gently reminding him that marriage required forgiveness, especially when children were involved. Andrew replied politely, without explaining anything, noticing how quickly the pressure spread once appearances were threatened. Vanessa escalated when reassurance didn't come. She showed up unannounced at his sister's house, insisting on seeing the kids, crying loudly enough for neighbors to notice, framing herself as a mother being kept away. Andrew let her see them, but stayed present the entire time, watching how Vanessa alternated between exaggerated affection and tense glances toward him, measuring how much control she still had. After she left, Emma asked why Mom seemed angry when she was smiling, and Andrew didn't correct her observation. He only said adults sometimes act strange when they're scared. A week later, Andrew's lawyer called to say Vanessa had already spoken to an attorney of her own and was asking about custody arrangements, financial support, and how quickly things could be formalized. The speed of it caught Andrew off guard, but not the direction. Vanessa wasn't waiting for reconciliation. She was preparing for damage control. That evening, she called Andrew calmly for the first time since he left, saying they should be practical, that dragging things out would only hurt the kids and attract attention, that people were already choosing sides without knowing the facts. She suggested an arrangement that left her primary custody and financial stability intact, while Andrew kept his reputation clean by staying quiet. When Andrew didn't agree immediately, she warned him that court would be ugly, that lawyers would dig into his work hours, his absences, anything that could be framed as neglect. Andrew listened, realizing this was the first conversation where she spoke clearly, not as his wife, but as someone negotiating terms. The following days moved quickly. Papers were drafted, meetings were scheduled. Andrew gathered school records, calendars, messages, not to punish Vanessa, but to protect himself and the kids from a narrative that was already being shaped without him. At school, other parents avoided eye contact, and Andrew heard through casual comments that Vanessa had been going through a hard time, that Andrew was distant, that everyone hoped they could work it out quietly. He said nothing, understanding now how silence could be mistaken for guilt. The pressure built steadily, not from confrontation, but from expectation, the unspoken agreement that he should smooth this over for the sake of comfort. The night before their first court hearing, Andrew sat alone and read through everything one last time, not looking for justification, but for clarity. He wasn't trying to win a war. He was trying to make sure the truth didn't get buried under politeness, fear, and the need for everyone else to feel at ease. The courthouse felt smaller than Andrew expected, not because of the room itself, but because so many people he recognized were suddenly there, sitting a few rows back, pretending coincidence while quietly choosing sides. Vanessa arrived early, dressed carefully, her posture composed in a way that signaled preparation rather than confidence, greeting acquaintances with practiced warmth as if this were another school event where appearances mattered. Andrew arrived with his lawyer and waited, watching Vanessa adjust her expression each time someone looked her way. switching between concern and resolve depending on who was watching. When the hearing began, the discussion moved quickly into schedules, finances, and custody, language that stripped months of tension down to bullet points and time blocks. Vanessa's attorney painted a picture of a mother holding the family together while Andrew prioritized work, hinting that distance had created emotional gaps no one could reasonably blame her for filling. Andrew didn't interrupt. When it was his turn, he didn't describe betrayal in dramatic terms or list grievances meant to shock the room. He spoke about routines, about who attended school meetings, who stayed home when Jacob was sick, who remembered Emma's rehearsal times without reminders. He explained how decisions were made quietly, how absences were explained away to protect the children, and how secrecy required planning that eventually took priority over honesty. When the judge asked about communication between the parents, Andrew described moments rather than emotions, pointing out how conversation shifted when questions became inconvenient, how concerns were reframed as threats to reputation rather than issues to resolve. Vanessa reacted sharply at first, interrupting through her attorney, then catching herself when the judge asked her to let him finish. As the hearing continued, text messages were referenced, calendars compared, and timelines laid out in ways that made it difficult to argue intent without addressing behavior. The turning point came when Emma's school counselor, called as a witness, described changes in the children's behavior, confusion about schedules, anxiety around transitions, details that hadn't been shared publicly but carried weight in the room. Vanessa's composure slipped for the first time, not because the information was unexpected, but because it was no longer manageable. She tried to redirect, insisting she was protecting the kids from adult issues, but the contrast between protection and secrecy had already been drawn. When the ruling came, it didn't deliver the clean victory either side might have imagined. Custody was shared, but structured in a way that required consistency and accountability rather than flexibility. Financial arrangements were fair, but firm, removing the leverage Vanessa had assumed she could keep. Outside the courtroom, friends approached Andrew cautiously, offering support that felt delayed and uncertain, while others avoided him entirely. Vanessa left quickly, phone already pressed to her ear, managing reactions before they reached her. In the weeks that followed, Andrew settled into a new routine with the kids, one that required more coordination and less assumption. Emma stopped asking when things would go back to normal and started asking what days she would be where, questions grounded in reality rather than hope. Jacob became quieter, but steadier, less reactive when plans changed. Vanessa struggled with the shift, discovering that control built on perception didn't translate well into shared responsibility, and that sympathy faded once logistics replaced stories. Andrew didn't feel victorious, but he did feel aligned with his choices. The moral didn't arrive as a lesson spoken aloud or a moment of triumph. It emerged gradually, in how consistency rebuilt trust with the children, in how silence used to protect appearances gave way to clarity that protected people. He learned that betrayal wasn't only about crossing a line, but about how far someone was willing to go to avoid being seen crossing it, and that choosing truth, even quietly, reshaped the future in ways reputation never could.